introducing the speaker today, which a lot of you might already know, Eric Olson. Eric's been the director of the Extension Lakes program since 2010. Oh my goodness, I can't believe it's been that long now. Before that, he was an instructor at the UWSP College of Natural Resources for 6 years, teaching land use planning and ecosystem management. And he also served during that time as an extension land use specialist. And fun fact, he was my graduate advisor. I just like to add that. So I've known Eric for a while. He has a forest degree from the University of Minnesota and a master's degree in urban and regional planning from UW-Madison. He recently, which is very exciting, became a riparian property owner, woohoo, with a new house on the Wisconsin River in Stevens Point's fashionable west side.
Yes. All right, thank you, Erin. So welcome to the Capacity Lab. This is sort of my day-long experiment that actually is 2 days long, so it's a bit of a bit to bite off, but what I'm trying to do is provide some assistance to lake organizations and watershed organizations and river organizations to let them know that there's sort of maybe a framework for them to increase their capacity to get things done. And that extension and a lot of our university folks are going to be there to try to help them along the way. This morning's talk is meant to be sort of the 101, the introduction to why the heck are we talking about lake capacity building and what do we mean by lake capacity building. We don't have a whole lot of time because the plenary does start, I believe, at 9 o'clock, and I got to scoot over there to the expo room. But I'll give this sort of prelude that what we talk about in this first session, if you're really interested in this capacity thing, we're going to be talking about different pieces of capacity, membership, organizational, relational, and programmatic, both today and then starting out tomorrow morning. And then Friday, the rest of the sessions, what we've arranged is basically presenters who can highlight their capacities at different levels, at different scales. So we're going to start off with some people talking about local capacity, and then we're going to talk about, well, what about sort of regional or county scale organizations? And then finally, at the end of the day tomorrow, we're going to talk about some groups that are operating at the statewide level and trying to basically not only carry out their programs, but help folks like you. So to kind of get into this, I kind of go back. I always like going, if you ever see me present, I like going back in history. I like understanding where things came from and how we got to where we are. So we're going to talk about why are we focusing on lake organizations? What is it about them? We're going to talk a bit about then why we focus on capacity, or why we think capacity is a place to focus on. We're going to talk about systems thinking just a little bit. This isn't meant to be an introduction to systems thinking or a comprehensive course in systems thinking, but I at least want to sort of throw the term out there and maybe plant a seed or invite some curiosity about what exactly systems thinking could do for lake organizations and for our work here. And then end by just talking about some resources that we're trying to make available to you and maybe ask you for some suggestions on resources you feel might be helpful. So, lake organizations in Wisconsin. This is sort of my bread and butter, or my day-to-day life is trying to understand and help out lake organizations around the state. They're unique in the sense that they are responsible, or they take some responsibility for caring for Wisconsin's lakes. Wisconsin's lakes are public resources. They're shared by everybody. The state of Wisconsin Constitution sort of sets up a situation where lakes belong to everybody, and we essentially have to then figure out how to take care of them. And a long time ago, as far back as 1898, folks in Lake Geneva were saying, you know what, we live on this lake, we have property on the lake, we should start talking to each other and figuring out ways that we can help manage and take care of this lake for different reasons. So 1898 is going back quite a ways. This is well before there was a Department of Natural Resources. This is well before, I think we even had a really good sense of what lake biology meant and how to study lakes. This was very early in the state's history. We took a huge step forward in the 1960s and 70s in terms of understanding lakes and also in terms of figuring out how to organize groups around lakes. And part of that was due to a major federal research project that used lakes in Wisconsin sort of as laboratories to test out some methods for restoring lakes that were unhealthy, and also to envision some situations where lakes themselves could be sources of economic development, rural economic development. So we're thinking of places like northern Wisconsin, where unemployment was high in the 1960s, and people were uncertain what the future was for those areas. And this research project said, well, maybe if we can cultivate tourism and second home ownership and maybe even retiree ownership in northern Wisconsin, that could provide some economic boost to these areas. So they researched different methods of developing lakeshore communities. And as part of this, Lowell Klessig went around the state and went to hundreds of lake association meetings to try and find out what makes them tick and how can the state of Wisconsin help them be more effective. And the quote up there that you hopefully have gotten a chance to read shows that he found that these people around the lakes, were singular in their passion for the lakes. Like nobody else in the state of Wisconsin was as excited or as interested in taking care of these lakes. But they found themselves kind of limited because they were just these voluntary associations. They didn't get a lot of respect from other units of government, and they struggled to raise money. They basically spent a lot of time just doing fundraisers that would help them do the work that they knew needed to be done. So Lowell and his colleagues at the time proposed changing state law to allow lake communities to form what we call lake districts. Is there anybody here from a lake district? Okay, quite a few people, great, that helps. Lake districts are special purpose units of local government. They are created largely by the people around the lake who want to form them. So they sign petitions and they basically petition to the county or to the town to say, we want this district to be created, and the primary reason is to take care of the lake, and mostly what the lake district is going to do is allow us to tax ourselves and tax our neighbors to create that funding resource so that we can take care of this lake. So this chart just goes through 2014, but it's meant to show sort of how the number, just the sheer number of lake organizations in the state of Wisconsin changed over time, going all the way back to the 1890s or the 1900s. You can see obviously just a few lake associations in that time, places like Lake Geneva. Someone's here from Green Lake Association. Do you know when the first group formed on Green Lake? Was it? It was late, 1951. Okay, so later. So in the 1940s and 50s, we did see a lot more groups forming. I think that was because maybe the development pressure was starting to increase after World War II. And this line is meant to demarcate about when the Lake District Law was passed, 1973, 74. And then the lighter shaded area is just the number of lake districts that formed in the state over that time. And you see even during that time, the number of lake associations was also increasing pretty dramatically. And we still see new lake associations forming. There was a workshop yesterday just for a handful of people who are interested in starting a new lake association. And we still see new lake districts forming. We see people seeing that as a viable tool for their lake and going through the district formation process. We try to keep track of where all these lake associations are and what lake districts and what lakes they're actually attached to. And if you add it all up, lake associations and lake districts are responsible for about 1,000 lakes in the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin has, by the most sort of liberal measure of what is a lake, we have about 15,000 lakes. That's if you include every single thing that could maybe be called a lake. But most people recognize lakes that maybe are 50 acres in size or larger. Most people recognize lakes if they have a name attached to them. So these 1,000 lakes are usually a lot of these larger lakes. They represent a pretty significant piece of the overall natural resource puzzle in Wisconsin. Lakes, of course, I don't need to sell you on this idea. Lakes are part of Wisconsin's identity. Lakes they do drive that tourism economy that I mentioned earlier, but they're also just part of our culture. People love going to the lake. People love fishing. We have over 1 million anglers in the state of Wisconsin. Lakes are also central to our ecology. We have the birds and the wildlife that we have in Wisconsin because of the water resources that we have. Without these water resources, we'd have just a whole different ecological community. So it is really important that we take care of these lakes, and lake organizations do seem poised to still play this major role. So a couple of years ago, we got together with some folks from the DNR and from the university and tried to sort of understand how exactly lake organizations fit into this management puzzle, natural resource management and taking care of lakes, whether it's protecting lakes from degradation or invasive species, or whether it's restoring lakes that have had some sort of damage to them. And we came up with this fairly simple diagram, so I'm just going to walk through this real quick. Lake organizations kind of fall over here, but this right-hand side of the model is the part that, especially in like the DNR world and maybe with your county land and water office or lake researchers, this is the area that they're very comfortable with. This is the sort of geological landscape where water runs off the land and ends up in streams and creeks, which end up in lakes. Or maybe if you're lucky and you're up north, you just have a lake that doesn't have a whole lot of streams coming into it, but still water's coming down, soaking into the ground, coming up as spring water in your lake and keeping that lake cool and clear. There's a relationship between land use and runoff and water quality. Hopefully I didn't freak anyone out just by saying that you all understand. Yes, there is a relationship between what goes on in a watershed, the precipitation that you get, whether it's snow like today or rain in the summer, and then the runoff that you get, and then water quality. We know that in areas like southeast Wisconsin, very urbanized areas, those watersheds have been dramatically modified. We have spent going on 150 years, maybe 200 years, going into watersheds and changing them physically. Sometimes it's as simple as cutting down some trees. Sometimes it's much more complex and involves ditching and draining wetlands and creating new hydrologic connections between one water system and another that wouldn't have otherwise existed. There was a grand project over 150 years ago to connect the Wisconsin River system and the Mississippi to the Great Lakes through the city of Portage. The idea was that you could build canal systems that would connect these water systems that otherwise were separate. That watershed land use connection, isn't just as simple as saying, well, what happens in the watershed affects runoff, which affects stream water quality. There's a lot of little variables underneath that. There's components of how we understand the watershed. This one just shows some of the basic ones: land cover, soils, topography, the terrain itself. Beneath each one of these, you can imagine land cover is made up of a bunch of other different components or variables, right? It could be urban, it could be forested, it could be ag. Soils is an important variable. We know that there's some areas like central Wisconsin where you have very sandy soils. There's other parts of the state in the southeast where the soils are much heavier and more clay-like. And up north, there's a lot more gravel and sand type mixtures. And then the topography. The state of Wisconsin, fortunately for us, isn't perfectly flat. There is some terrain out there. It does make things a little bit interesting. It's not like being in Montana or Colorado, but that topography obviously separates out our different watersheds, distinguishes one lake's watershed from another. We have spent easily tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, documenting and studying this relationship, going out and mapping the landscape, creating very in-depth databases of what the soils look like, what the topography is. We're going out now, these days, if you want to measure topography very accurately at like the county scale. Does anyone know what they're using to do this now?
Drones.
Not drones. They're using lasers. They're going up with planes that are mounted with remote sensing equipment that essentially scan the landscape and shoots back information so that they can get topography within 6-inch or less discrepancies. So they could detect if you left your lawnmower out in the yard. We're spending a lot of money up here and time, and it's for a good reason, right? They want to accurately portray what is this relationship between precipitation and runoff and water quality. Question. The trees, part of it actually will detect where there's trees, that you can distinguish between a coniferous tree and a deciduous tree, and then some of the lasers will make it all the way to the ground, and there's then sort of a model that'll fill in the blanks and show like, well, there's the ground, and here's the trees. They can actually, they're using the LiDAR now to estimate the volume of forest in a forestry situation. So foresters don't have to go out anymore and like measure the trees from the ground, they just scan them from above. They want to accurately model this in part because, well, because our water's still not healthy. There's still challenges out there, and we're trying to figure out ways to put watersheds on basically runoff diets, nutrient diets. Sometimes you hear TMDL, total maximum daily load, trying to figure out what would it really take to protect this lake from all this runoff, not just for this year, not just next year, but for the long term. What's it really going to look like? What does a sustainable landscape look like? And if you don't have good land cover and soils and topography data, you're kind of left to fudge some numbers. They want to dial in and get it highly accurate. So what we have is places like the DNR, USGS, the USDA, local governments, spending a lot of time working out this relationship. We try to introduce into this discussion that the stream water quality and lake water quality, right, so runoff affects the streams, which affects the lakes, also affects quality of life. That if your lakes are going downhill, or if your lakes become less usable, or in the case of like Tainer Monoman, where your lakes become sort of a detractor, if they become sources of blue-green algae, then your quality of life is sort of capped, or maybe it starts to go down. We believe that if you improve stream water quality and improve lake water quality, we'll have a better quality of life in Wisconsin. So there's important reasons to understand this relationship and to try to work on it. This loop here starts with lake organizations. You can't read what this box says next to it, but essentially lake organizations are capable of feeding resources, we'll talk about what those resources are in a second, feeding resources into restoration activities that can mitigate that runoff relationship. So lake organizations are just one of the places where we might find volunteers or donations or materials and supplies, or maybe just the use of the land itself in the riparian ring. Providing those resources so that more restoration activities can take place to mitigate this watershed runoff land use relationship. We know that if we can increase the capacity of your lake organizations, if you feel like you're capable of doing more things, then that should increase the flow of resources into restoration, which should help protect and restore lakes. Seems pretty straightforward. Question?
I have a question about how human activity fits into your model. Would you put, say, human choices about land use under watershed land use?
Yeah, under watershed land use, this is where, like, especially in the land cover area, we've made all these modifications. We've changed that landscape. So it could be as simple as, a farmer choosing to go, they're doing corn rotations on 600 acres of farmland, to that farmer deciding, you know what, I'm gonna ease up on my cash crops and maybe put in some cover crops once in a while and try and keep more of the soil on the landscape and allow more of the water to infiltrate. So that's one decision. But the land cover takes place in the riparian ring. Whenever a shoreline property owner decides to maybe take out some trees because they block the view, and maybe increase the turf area in their backyard by the lake, that's a subtle change in land cover, but on the holistic scale, it can have the same type of consequences. It's changing the landscape, and we can maybe encourage those people to do things differently.
So I'm thinking about, boats going lake to lake and moving invasive species around.
Sure.
In
This model that we worked out, because we had a bunch of stormwater people and watershed analysts, they focused on that. But I would say that aquatic invasive species can play a role in this as well. That there's sort of a baseline scenario of activities that affect the water, so the activities would all be over here that affect water, and then there's a role for intervention, or people to say, you know what, let's modify these activities. Let's educate boaters at the landing. let's inspect our lake and make sure that if there is invasive species, we find them early before they've become really widespread. So there's definitely a role there. And again, lake organizations are they're the powerhouses that can provide some of the fuel to make these things happen. How much fuel or how do we understand what lake orgs are up to? There's many different ways to measure it. Part of how, if you're here tonight for the banquet, you're going to see and hear about some of the powerhouses, right? We give awards to lake organizations that do exemplary work, but there's hundreds of lake organizations that are just kind of quietly doing the work that needs to be done. They're sort of the stable workhorses of lake protection. And if you add it all up, lake and watershed groups at least raise and expend $15 million a year total in Wisconsin on restoration and protection activities. And that number is probably still going up. Every year going on, we'll see probably more money by groups like yours. And I'm not saying just wet your whistle about the money thing, but it's a way to translate the activities you do. It's sort of a currency for just measuring activity. And in these lake organizations, the model that we're also trying to portray or talk about is that you can't just say, well, they have capacity generically. We're trying to break that into some different components. And you kind of see them listed on the wall behind me. And on the diagram that you maybe have seen in our newsletter, at the base of it is membership. This has to do with the community itself, the education or awareness of your audiences, the stakeholders. Maybe it's the riparian property owners, maybe it's the recreators. But are they aware of the need for protection and restoration? And do they then join groups? Do they contribute to your cause to try to help you get things done? Above membership is organizations, which is in many cases the lake associations and lake districts are organizations. And that's kind of where a lot of our focus is on getting your organizational capacity increased. But next to that is relationships. We've learned from experience that a lake association all by itself can only get so far. You need to develop partnerships and working relationships and personal relationships, just knowing who your county land and water conservationist is, knowing who your DNR biologist is. Those are relationships that are going to be important for you to be able to get things done. And at the peak of our pyramid that we envision is programmatic capacity. And that is getting things done. That is doing things like mustering the volunteers and the other maybe paid staff to be at the boat landing. That is raising money to cost share the stream restoration project in the watershed that's going to reduce the sediment and nutrient load into your lake. Carrying out those programs is where we all want to be. And in my mind, I guess, after now 8 or 9 years of this convention, I think that's why a lot of you come here, is because you're like, look, we want to get more things done. We know we're doing good things today, but we know we also could probably do a little bit more, and we're trying to pick up ideas from other lakes. We're trying to learn from scientists and other resource managers. What should we do? And then we want to go out and actually do these things. But our model says it's going to be hard to just do things if you don't have the pieces below it, if you don't have your membership capacity, your organizational capacity, and your relationship capacity. I've been watching different lake organizations as they sort of advance their own efforts, and in some ways they're surprising us in how ambitious and aggressive they are in terms of scoping out what their issues are and coming up with plans to address them. So one group I'd encourage you all to kind of learn about and check out online if you haven't yet is the Clean Lakes Alliance in Dane County. They only formed as an organization, I think within the last 10 to 12 years. And they saw in Dane County, where there already is a lot of resources, there already is a lot of state and county and local government effort directed towards taking care of Lake Mendota and the chain of lakes there. They still saw a gap. They still said, look, it's still not happening fast enough. We're not getting the results that we want, and we want to add more to the mix. We want to raise money to pay for projects. We want to also excite people around the Madison community about lake issues to get them interested in it. And we want to bring more people together to solve lake problems. So they developed something called Plan 2020, now a few years ago, where they said, we really want to hit this water quality outcome. We want to have a certain level of clarity in the lake, and we want to almost eliminate the days where there's a blue-green algae bloom. The Mendota system does have these harmful algal blooms in the summer that forces them to close beaches and give people sort of recreational advisories. So they're trying to bring back water quality. They know from looking at the historic record that these lakes used to be fairly clear. There was a time when these lakes were quite clear during the summer, and so they know that's achievable, but they also know it's a big project. So what you see on the right is sort of a summary of their ambition. They say, well, we need to cut out 46,000 pounds of phosphorus from watershed loading coming into the lake. A good chunk of that is agriculture, but also a fairly good chunk comes from the cities themselves, Madison and its suburbs. And they calculated it out. They actually broke out a table that said, piece by piece, or slices of the pie at a time, here are the different ways we believe we can hit 46,000 pounds of reduction. And if you added them up in terms of an estimated cost, that's where $130 million comes out. And most of you are like, whoa.
I know Dane County's doing a lot of good work, and if I use that as an example in my community, I'd be tomatoes, because Dane County, outside of Dane County, is not always perceived as the optimum. They're looking at $7 million per year in our community. They start to look at their tax bill and expect to pay, there's 1,000 people on the lake divided by 7 million, blah, blah, blah.
Right. So we're going to talk about that in a second.
Do you have a frugal example?
So do I have a frugal example?
Well, outside of Madison, real world example.
Right? Well, hold your hats here for a second. So again, just before I move on to the next slide, they're saying, how are they focusing on phosphorus reduction? It's through farmland management. It's leaf management in the cities, innovative solutions. They sponsor things like biodigesters to deal with manure that otherwise might go on fields. Construction erosion reduction. There's still a lot of building taking place in the watershed, and so every time a new structure gets put up, they're trying to focus on making sure they don't have excess soil runoff from storm events. And then community engagement. They're working on education, volunteerism, monitoring, and citizen action. So $7 million a year. All right. We're
Projected plan, they haven't started this yet.
they're doing it.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's
It's a huge watershed.
it is. But let's talk bigger. So my house now, sits on the Wisconsin River, and we're in the Wisconsin River watershed right now. And the Wisconsin River watershed just completed its nutrient diet, its budget, its nutrient budget to figure out what does a total maximum daily load look like for the whole Wisconsin River system. And this is motivated largely by the lakes or the impoundments that sit at the downstream portion of this. So the Castle Rock and Petenwell flowage and Lake Wisconsin are the sort of downstream recipients of all the land use change that happens upstream from them. It's all coming their way every year, all the time. And this chart here sort of diagrams the total amount of phosphorus coming in to the system, starting up at the top and then going all the way down to the bottom of the system. So you're looking at Rhinelander up here, Tomahawk, Merrill. And what you're seeing here also is where it's coming from. This brownish, orangish color is agriculture. The purplish color are the wastewater treatment facilities, like their sewer plants that come out of Wausau and Rhinelander and Stevens Point. There's some urban runoff that's kind of in the mix. And then there's even just background levels of phosphorus coming in. So most of the analysis is that if you want to hit your water quality goals in Petenwell, Castle Rock, and in Lake Wisconsin, you need to reduce about 60 to 70% of the nutrients coming out of that watershed. And if you look at the grand totals over here, 800 tons per year, and you just say, okay, well, what's 60%, 60 to 70% of that? It's about 1 million pounds per year. That's where we should be or where we want to get as far as water quality in the Wisconsin River. So if there's any math wizards in the room, help me out with this one. This is 1 million pounds a year. This was 46,000 pounds per year. 46,000 pounds per year might need a budget of about $7 million a year. 1 million pounds per year needs a pretty hefty budget, right? So, do we just throw up our hands and walk away? No, you're lake people. I love you. we try to figure it out. We're going to follow Bill Foley's advice and say, well, can you show me a less expensive model than the Dane County model? Are there ways we can do this that don't involve such an expenditure? And a lot of those ways has to do with just encouraging people to maybe voluntarily start modifying how they act on the landscape. And it involves voluntarily changing your practices on your shoreline property, maybe putting in a rain garden, installing a rain barrel, or it involves people in the ag sector voluntarily changing cropping practices. Again, going from cash grain to more of a healthy soils approach, which is the label that we're giving now to an alternative farming method that doesn't say, you've got to give up everything and become like a 5-acre back to the land vegetable farmer, but you can't keep plowing as much as you plow now, and you can't keep the soil exposed for as long of the year as you do now. We need to figure out ways to reduce the amount of tillage and reduce the amount of time that the soil is just sitting out there exposed. So again, that's just talking about nutrients and runoff. What other issues do lakes face? Someone already mentioned invasive species moving around. Is invasive species the only issue? What else are you guys focusing on as lake groups? Carp. So kind of an invasive species, but something that's definitely undesirable and needs to be managed. I know like on Big Green Lake, they're doing some carp management projects. In the back? Big motorcraft, motorboats and recreational activities that might be disturbing shoreline and resuspending sediment. You're also trying to work in that really challenging area of like trying to make everybody happy, right? So the people operating the large watercraft are like, well, I'm having a good time. Well, I don't know what your problem is. But you're trying to figure out like, okay, in this lake community, are there ways that we can actually both have our cake and eat it too? Have fun and have a healthy lake, or have fun and not annoy everybody else on the water. So, going back to this model, our thinking for the last couple of years has been that it's not just we don't take this capacity thing as just a given fixed amount. We believe that sort of like developing muscles or developing complex thinking skills, if you apply yourself towards it, if you work on it, you can actually get better at it over time. And so we think that there's a way that we can take your capacity levels and and measure them. So this is kind of a part of what we're trying to do with Extension and DNR, say, how do we measure capacity? There's got to be some way. Then can we do specific programming, sort of like today's capacity lab, starting out with 101, but doing some focused discussions about the different components of capacity, membership, organizational, relational, and programmatic, to get you to a point of enhanced capacity to boost, again, the level of resources that lake organizations can provide. And I don't want to sound like I'm picking on lake organizations. You're not the only group that needs better capacity. I need more capacity. UW Extension Lakes needs some more capacity. The Wisconsin DNR could still even use a little bit more capacity. Your counties, all these different partners probably need more capacity, but a lot of them have different methods to go about getting it, right? If I'm in the DNR and in some ways I want to increase capacity, if I say, well, I wish we had $2 million more each year in the grant program to help people out, You go to the legislature and you go to the governor and say, can we get $2 million more into this program? Or if they say we need a couple more people, same process. You don't necessarily have that same capability. You don't just go to the Lake Association board and say, next year we should just magically get $100,000 more money. You have to figure it out. You have to work on it. If lake districts, the people who raised their hand earlier, we do believe that lake districts begin sort of from an elevated position of capacity. That a lake district automatically has the ability to raise some money, just like Lowell predicted. They don't have to spend quite as much time and effort just holding raffles or figuring out ways to raise money to do projects. They can just focus on the projects themselves. So Bill Foley is here from Beaver Dam Lake in Dodge County. They're going through the grueling process of trying to form a lake district, I imagine much because of the same thinking, that they realized that if they didn't have to put so much time and effort into fundraising, they could probably get more done. Would that be accurate?
That's correct. Implementation's key now, not the planning and study.
Right, so programmatic capacity, executing projects on the landscape, getting things done, whether it's at the boat landing or whether it's on the landscape. How are we going to get there? So we believe this is also a complicated problem, that if it was easy, I wouldn't have to force myself to set up the capacity lab and try to talk through some of these issues over the course of 2 days. I would just pick up a manual and say, well, here's the lake capacity manual. Everyone just read it and be done. Instead, it's what we call a wicked problem. It's a problem of unknowns and unknown unknowns. We don't know exactly what separates out a really high capacity organization from an organization that struggles. We have some theories maybe, but we have to kind of test it out. And because lake organizations are constantly evolving and changing, there's no stable thing to study there. It's really complicated. So we believe that we have to try to use sort of a systems thinking approach to this, to essentially think as hard about the problem as we think the problem is, to scale up the complexity of our thinking. So this just is a super simplification of what the heck do we mean by systems thinking, but it points out that there is sort of this objective real world out there. We are sitting in a room, there's carpet on the floor, there's lights above us, but we have a mental model of sort of what this room is for, and it's just an approximation of the real world, okay? You all have a mental model of what a dog is, right? I don't have to really describe to you what a dog is. You have a dog in your mind, right? But there's not actually a dog in your mind. It's just a mental model of a dog, right? And you all grew up, for the most part, I'm going to assume, in North America. And so you would be offended, or it would challenge your model if I told you we're actually having dog soup for lunch, right? But there's other people in the world who that's part of their mental model. They grew up, dog soup, no big deal. The real world provides feedback to our mental model. So we're always apprehending new information. We're always encountering different experiences and using that feedback to change our mental model. But by the time we get about my age and the age of a lot of people in this room, we get really comfortable with our mental models, and we tend to kind of sit back in our mental lazy boy and just kind of let the model play out. We don't want to hear any new discomforting information. But the idea of this is to say, no, let's stretch ourselves a little bit. Let's be open to new information. Let's be open to new ideas. And let's challenge our mental models once in a while. So our model of this programmatic relationship, or the capacity relationship, again, looks perfectly like this. If I want to say that I'm a systems thinker, I can't get wed to this. I can't say, well, this is it. It's done. I never want to talk about it again. I really want feedback from people who are working out in the organizations. What are we missing in this model? I also want to say that this is also an oversimplification of what you're dealing with. Whenever, and we'll see this tomorrow, I think, when we talk about programmatic capacity, it's not just this neat little piece of the pyramid that you plunk on top of the other three parts. It has tentacles and relationships that feed down into the membership. And even below membership, there's something else. There's like the broad level of awareness of the public in the United States and in Wisconsin. That's also murkier stuff that we don't really have much ability to modify, but we're trying to build our membership on top of it. So some resources for you. You might want to jot down if I've wet your whistle enough and you're interested in digging into this. And I have a couple of copies up here. You can peek at them. They're going to stay in this room today and tomorrow, but you can take a look at these. The book here is just Systems Thinking Made Simple. Derek Cabrera and his wife are they're scholars of education, scholars of learning, trying to understand how exactly do people learn new things, how do some people do that better than others, and what can we do to try to improve everybody. They're trying to take systems thinking into the classroom, K-12, and try to get teachers to be more aware of systems thinking concepts and using them in the classroom. So that's what this book is about. I don't have copies of Flock Not Clock, but it's basically their version of, and you can imagine there's lots of these, how to kind of do organizational planning to get things done. So they've come up with a framework based on their experience working with teachers and working with researchers. So it says align people, processes, and systems to achieve your vision. They got a big federal grant, kind of like Lowell did back in the day, that allowed them to do a project, and it was called ThinkWater. ThinkWater is kind of in this winding down phase, because anything that's sort of grant dependent usually comes to some subtle conclusion. But there's this web page that's still out there, thinkwater.us/toolkit. There's a lot of resources on there to help you introduce yourself to systems thinking. You don't necessarily need to go through a class or have me stand up here and give you Systems Thinking 101. You can work through the toolkit. It's set up so that there's pieces for educators, for agencies like the DNR or maybe like a lake organization, for researchers, as well as for the public. So I encourage you to check out the ThinkWater webpage. I'm also trying to kind of walk the walk by focusing on capacity in our quarterly newsletter. So if you're not a subscriber of Lake Tides, I'd encourage you to check it out. You can find it online on our webpage. I'm going to be focusing on one of these 4 dimensions each issue. So it's kind of convenient for me that there's 4 issues of Lake Tides a year, and I can just kind of break it up this way. And then I've struggled to do this, but I want to create also sort of a web corner that just summarizes these things. For now, the best way to find the articles that have been written so far is just to go to the Lake Tides newsletter and pick up some of the back issues. So this has only been happening for about just over a year now. And this is sort of the mapped out where we see today, how I see today and tomorrow going. So after the plenary, we're going to come back and talk about that membership capacity. We actually have quite a bit of time to discuss it. David, who's the membership coordinator for Wisconsin Lakes, has agreed to kind of join me. And it's going to be, the reason why I call this a capacity lab is because it's not going to be just a bunch of standing up in front of the screen and me shouting out PowerPoints. It's going to be interactive, and we're going to talk about some of how we understand these 4 different dimensions of capacity and maybe field some examples from your work with either with lake organizations or other groups as to how you've seen organizational, relational, programmatic, and membership capacity. And then, like I said, if you look at the program, we have a couple of people coming in to kind of describe how they get things done. So it's that, again, the idea that you're all here to kind of hear how other people get things done so that maybe you can pick up some key ideas that you can take home and try out in practice. So we've got, I think, 5 different people joining us on Friday to share those examples. And I believe I have just a little bit of time for questions, so I'm going to field a couple of questions way in the back.
Yeah, I wonder, do organizations have part of their program protests in places where the worst problem is, and to be able to educate people by gathering people together and having a protest in a place where there's something really terrible happening and it's being ignored because it's industrial, so people with a lot of money can protect it?
Sure. So the question is sort of like what role for, I don't want to call it political action, but just sort of media attention and calling out problems. I'd say that definitely. Yeah, but that is sort of a, I know some people who are sort of planning a rally on Earth Day, and it's like, you can't just say, we're going to rally, and then it happens. You still have to have these other pieces. Who's your audience? Who are the people who are going to rally? A protest of one person isn't going to gain a lot of media attention or make a big splash.
Well, that's why I'm asking, is it part of organizations to actually have that be part of what they do?
Potentially. It really, it depends on if you're in sort of that push versus shove situation. It's not very common in the lake world to see that level of intensity around a particular issue, but I do know, like at Lake Wisconsin, for example, they're challenged by groundwater that's moving off of a closed military base that the military and the federal government don't seem to really care about. So they're like, well, how are we going to raise this issue? How do we raise a stink about what we see happening to our water resource? So I don't think they've done necessarily a protest or a rally, but I could see that type of situation. Another way to look at these kind of focal points, though, too, is to integrate them into the planning and management. So for decades, we've known that there are these highly toxic areas on the Great Lakes systems, on Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, formal industrial sites. Over time, they became labeled as areas of concern with impairments. And over time, we got the federal government to say, here's some massive amounts of money for the Great Lake Restoration Initiative. And then they put out bids. And then engineers come in and say, we can fix this. And now we're seeing areas of concern on the Great Lakes finally being delisted. So they've cleaned up the toxins. They've made these areas recreationally usable and ecologically usable as well. So there's the protest way, and there's also this weird sort of bureaucratic, just identify your priorities and get them into the planning queue.
Could you put up the triangle again?
Sure.
And to build on her comments, I would see that, take that as the ability to flip that the other way around. Just turn it 180 degrees, put membership on the top, with programs on the bottom.
Yeah.
Because I see this that you're using today, a model for 20 to 30-year results. If you flip it the other way and really increase membership and drive things down, I think we have a chance for 10-year results.
Yeah.
It's just building up your points.
Yep.
I think today we beg and claw and ask for changes in our local governments, in our state governments, and it's getting a 20 to 40-year payout. If we flip that and drive through with increasing membership and drive through getting more focus and strategic planning throughout the state,
Yeah.
I think we can make just a faster approach, keeping all of your elements that you talked about in place, just a different emphasis.
Well, I'd agree with you, and I'd say it still can happen somewhat in this imagining, because what, for example, Clean Lakes Alliance has done, and I think what you all have been trying to do in Tanner-Monoman as well, is to go away from the idea that, well, the only people who should care about this lake are riparian property owners. Like, you have to be a homeowner on the lake. In the case of Madison, there's not many of those. Instead, they're trying to say, everybody in this community ought to feel like they're part of this strategy. And the way they've been executing that is to recruit people from corporations and large employers to participate in hands-on volunteer projects in the watershed that address not directly even lake water quality issues, maybe indirectly. So the Clean Lakes Alliance is organizing volunteer days to do buckthorn removal and invasive plant removal in the watershed, realizing that that's a huge gap, that nobody seems to be doing it. And if you just go to the county, they say, well, we don't have the time or the money to do that. And they say, well, great. Why don't we go out and get a couple hundred volunteers from Land's End or from some other company, and we'll show up for a day, and I'll show you what 100 people can do with clippers and gloves and start pulling this stuff out. And yeah, they're not going to get it done in 1 year, the whole project, but they try to cultivate this idea that all those people who work at the company or who live in the Madison community want to do these things. It's a cool thing to do. They're excited about volunteering out there. I'll give you one example of what we're trying to do here at the hotel. It's going to sound kind of corny, but there's a pond out here at the hotel. And we talked a couple of years ago about, wouldn't it be cool if that pond, instead of being surrounded just by rock, right now it's just rocks, wouldn't it be cool if there was native plants around that pond that invited butterflies and birds to spend time there? We talked to the hotel and they said, you know what, we agree. We should be able to do that. We're not going to do the whole pond in 1 year. That's biting off too much. But if you identify a portion of the pond, let's pull the rocks out, let's rip out the sealant underneath it, let's get some soil in there and let's plant some native plants. And they'll allow their staff to take a day or part of a day to be on the clock, but while they're on the clock, they're volunteering with us at the pond, helping to plant. So in 1 day, we got, I can't remember how many hundreds of plants, but the staff from UW Extension Lakes and the staff from the hotel started getting things done. Now those hotel, I'm not going to delude myself and think like, oh, now they're all ecologically aware people. Maybe though after the second or third time volunteering out there and noticing that the old plants are starting to get bigger now and they're starting to attract insects and birds, they start to see, oh, this is a lot better than rocks, you know? So we're trying to cultivate it very broadly. I agree it might, yeah, you're right, you want to go fast. And in some crisis situations, you might need to try to go fast. But we also have a theory that says sustainability is going to be about building things durably. I'm running out of time. I will be back here after the plenary, cutting into membership. And again, we have plenty of time to talk about that, so it's going to be sort of an extension on this. I want to thank you for coming to this session. Thank you for coming to the Lakes Convention. And maybe we'll see you in here after the plenary.